What is architecture?
Do you begin with the easy question? That's it's a question that I would find almost impossible to give a single answer to or an encompassing answer. You think about it all the time, at least I do, and I know that there are times where, in certain places and situations where it's really important to argue for architecture as an art form. That is always the endangered aspect of architecture, because there is, of course, it's an odd question. I discuss this often. We're a licensed profession, and so if you want to define what an architect is and what architecture is within the United States, I think with most places, this is defined by things like the American Institute of Architects. I think we understand quite clearly, at least I do, and a number of my colleagues do, that there is a different and far more complicated set of criteria when we discuss architecture as a cultural project, as an art form, in addition to and beyond professional service. Not entirely independent of it, of course, but still quite more complex discussion. Complex because it is a cultural project. It's I try to discuss architecture relative to other art forms, and one argument would be that each art form has its particular set of questions that are asked, or the particular set of features that one has to wrestle with. Within architecture, I think there would be a kind of common understanding that the difference between, say, it and painting is use. But I don't think so. In fact, I think, for instance, that is why architecture and the design fields, I think, are radically different. I think architecture has nothing to do with, say, product design, say, Nike. What is it then, I think often, that is the defining feature of architecture? I don't have I'm not sure I can explain this exactly, but it seems like what architecture deals in is a certain kind of danger. It is almost a mortal danger. This would certainly be overlapped between, say, the professional description of an architect and, when you study here in the United States, a lot of the licensing has to do with making sure you make a building that doesn't kill anyone, because in fact it's very easy for them to do that. So that's serious. But I think the extent to which architecture is there, it looms there, it is inescapable, it shapes the life that you live in it, that's its art to do that. And it's enormous existential responsibility. It is how we exist. And so in that sense, I always imagine that architecture is, its defining characteristic is danger.
What can architecture do?
Well, hopefully what it doesn't do is kill too many people. I think if you know this happens in a lot of cities, but if you know the history of the tenements of the Lower East Side of Manhattan, etc., architecture is very good for bringing together too many people in an area that can't sustain them, and people die of disease and other horrible calamities, fire, etc. So we know that it ought not to do that. Probably the thing that does distinguish what architecture, the thing that it does, the thing that makes it different than, say, the professional definition of architecture, its key feature is actually useless, in the same way that a painting is of no use. Right? Maybe it's raining, you can take a painting and put it over your head. It might be of some use. But the thing that, or it covers a hole on the wall, right? So we understand it has a use, maybe a little bit of use. But the thing that makes it a painting and the thing that makes it essential, an absolutely necessary part of human expression, is also a useless thing. So I think in the end, architecture doesn't do anything.
What is your architectural position?
Well, that's, maybe the first question was even easier. We're in my partner, Laura Bauman, and myself, we're in the throes of putting together a series of publications on our work. We waited long enough to do the monograph that two things happened. First off, there's too much work to fit into a book, and number two, the monograph seems to be dead. So we've invented instead what we call the polygraph, which of course, at least in English, is also the word for a lie detector test, right? which people understand it doesn't really work. So it's also kind of our idea of a publication, and it's based on something that might be useless. In doing this has given us occasion to look back over, I've been in practice for a number of years in previous partnerships and on my own. And we try to find what is that single thread that ties all of our work together. And I began worrying that there wasn't one. A current interest of ours is composing projects, especially large projects at an urban scale, that are fundamentally and categorically heterogeneous. That is to say, it is not one thing, it's a number of things that in some fundamental ways are not like each other. It sounds like something that ought to be very easy to do because it's simply, there's an element of randomness in it. It's quite difficult. It goes quite contrary to a lot of training and assumptions about architecture. But in looking back at our work, I went all the way back to my own thesis that I did at Harvard. This would be 1985, 1986. Schizophrenic Space was the title of the thesis. And I realized in rereading my statement that it had to do with the combination of fundamentally heterogeneous pieces into one thing. So it turns out this thing that I thought was not a theme is actually exactly what my architecture is about. So it is, for lack of a more elegant phrase, it is about the juxtaposition of categorically heterogeneous components. We were a number of years back when I was working with my old partner, Bahram Sherdel, and also working in an advising way with Jeffrey Kipnis. There was a term that we were using that I think Peter Eisman first used, which is weak form. Weak form comes about, it's a kind of adaptation, bastardization of the term weak thought from the Italian philosopher Gianni Vattimo. I'm not a philosopher, but as I understand Vattimo's work, it was against a proposition for a philosophical system that was against this model of the grand totalizing philosophy that would supplant the previous grand totalizing philosophy. That what was needed instead was that there was a kind of liberation of heterogeneity. And so this idea of weak thought, as opposed to the strong thought of the great philosophical traditions, was seen as a kind of political emancipation of idea from rigid ideology. And I suppose our own interest in weak form had to do with that, what I think was once termed the disciplined relaxation of geometry. But I realized that even more, having projects that are difficult to categorize as any single thing, is probably, at least if you ask me today, is most what our architecture is about.
What is your design method?
Well, two things. I don't think architecture is design, and I don't think architecture is method. So, other than that, as I mentioned before, design is as it's used now. You know, the Apple and the Nike and the graphic. It is a fundamentally different activity than architecture. I think of those as visual fields. I think they are about creating things to place into the world. This is what I think of as design. I think of architecture as a couple of steps more fundamental than that. It's sort of the armature into which you can place design objects. Now, as for methodology, maybe it's just semantics. The term that I use is technique, which is difficult to describe. It is different. It is not so... methodology implies a certain kind of formula. Saying it is simply artistic implies a lack of discipline. The word technique to me is neither of those things exactly. It is a kind of precise and developed, yet ultimately nonverbal way in which a project proceeds from not existing to existing. I mean, this is what we, of course, spend a lot of our time doing. It would be impossible for me to try to summarize what that is other than we spend a lot of time working through various techniques. And I suppose one hallmark of them is to find ways of working in which one can produce things that are in excess of what one is capable of doing. You know, that's which I suppose is all one can hope for.